Take my children instead of me. What kind of heartbreak forces a mother to beg for her children's lives, knowing she hasn't eaten in 3 days herself? How many years of silence, shame, and hunger carved those words into her soul? And yet, what if that desperate plea was not the end of her story, but the very moment love and hope began to find her again? The wind of late summer swept across the plains like a weary sigh, carrying grit into the corners of the old train depot at Ash Hollow. By the time Clara reached the wooden steps, her boots were dust-choked, her face lined not only by years but by weeks of hunger, and her sack torn so wide it barely clung to her shoulder. In one arm she carried 6-year-old Rosie, her small body too light for her age. In the other she guided Eli, 10 years old, whose eyes had grown older than his boyish frame should allow. She did not come with roses or rings, nor with the coy smile of a young bride. She came with children whose bellies had not known supper in 3 nights, and with a heart that still impossibly held on to dignity. When the sack split open, its few treasures spilled onto the dry boards: a worn shawl, a half-crushed sprig of rosemary, and a chipped enamel cup the color of faded sky. The cup rolled toward the boots of the man who had been standing there all along, Thomas the rancher folks called lonely, a widower who kept to himself at the edge of the valley. He bent down, picked it up, and for a moment his calloused fingers lingered on the rim, as if the small thing carried weight. Clara's voice cracked more from shame than from the dust. "Please, if you cannot take me, take the children. They have not eaten in 3 days." The words hung in the stillness, harsher than any wind. Around them the depot was nearly empty. Only 2 men loitered near the telegraph pole, whispering, smirking. But Thomas did not smirk. His gray eyes studied her, then dropped to the children. He saw how Rosie clutched the torn hem of her mother's skirt, how Eli stood straight though his knees trembled. Without a word, Thomas reached into his satchel, pulled out a piece of jerky, and knelt to place it in Eli's palm. "Eat, boy," he said softly. To Rosie he offered the canteen from his belt, steadying her tiny hands around it. Then his gaze returned to Clara. "You didn't come here to beg," he said finally. "You came here to work." Tears threatened, but she held them back. "I can cook, wash, men tend a garden. All I ask is a place where they won't starve." Thomas nodded once slowly, like a man weighing more than hunger. "I've got a ranch that's too quiet, a house with more dust than bread. If you're willing, there's room at my table, but not as charity." He handed back the enamel cup. "As a fair trade of work for shelter." Clara closed her fingers around the chipped rim. For the first time in weeks, she breathed without the taste of panic. She had not been dismissed as worthless, nor had her children been torn away. They had been seen. That night, as the last light bled out across the prairie, Clara followed Thomas toward the valley. The children rode in the wagon, already drowsy from full bellies of beans and cornbread offered at the depot's small kitchen. Clara sat beside them, her sack patched hastily with twine, the rosemary sprig tucked safely back inside. Every bump in the road seemed to whisper the same question: had she just stepped into another bargain that would break her, or had she found the fragile beginning of something like home? The stars were rising by the time the wagon rolled past the gate of the Boone Ranch. In the hush, Clara touched the enamel cup at her side. A vessel chipped, yes, but still able to pour warmth. Perhaps that was what she was too. A mother offered to give away her children and instead found a man who handed back her dignity. But can dignity survive the whispers of a town that sees only shame? By morning, the Boone Ranch began to breathe again. The stove, once a cold hulk of iron, took flame under Clara's careful hands. She moved through the kitchen with the quiet confidence of someone who had made do in darker places, sorting beans by lamplight, rinsing the dust from a handful of potatoes, coaxing a little salt into tasting like blessing. Eli stacked kindling by the wood box, proud as a deputy. Rosie leaned her cheek against the table and hummed to the sprig of rosemary Clara had set in a chipped teacup of water, as if the herb were a small green friend. From the doorway, Thomas watched. He had slept little, kept awake by the memory of her words at the depot and the steady drum of his own heart knocking like a stranger, asking to be let in. Morning put everything in plainer light, the patched coats drying by the hearth, the children's small boots lying neatly beneath the bench, the woman at his stove, a stranger and not a stranger, both at once. When the broth began to steam, Clara tore a stub of old sourdough she had carried in her sack hard as a stone from travel and pinched it into the pot. She crushed the rosemary between her fingers, its scent rising green and clean. The room shifted almost imperceptibly, as if the walls had exhaled. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Thomas asked, his voice a half-whisper, cautious not to disturb whatever Grace had settled. Church kitchens, line camps, a winter camp up near St. Bride's, once bitterest cold I ever knew. When the flour ran low, the sister said, "Break a piece from what's left, let yesterday teach today how to rise." So I did. She smiled, small and honest. Sometimes the memory of bread is what keeps a body going until the bread itself arrives. He turned that sentence over like a coin. Let yesterday teach today how to rise. Something in it trembled, a wire strung inside him years ago. "St. Bride's," he said, "up along the cottonwoods." She nodded, adding the last sliver of rosemary. "Big storm. Long Advent. I was there a week, maybe 8 nights. We fed whoever could push a door open. The wire pulled tighter. A picture flashed, snow hammering the chapel roof, a line of men and boys steamed with breath, the smell of broth, thin as a hymn, stretched to reach the back pew. A woman bundled shawl pinned at the shoulder with a plain button, ladling bowls and pressing a small warm heel of bread into the cold hands of a cowboy who had nearly given up. He remembered the bread most of all. Rosemary and salt, the taste of not being invisible. "I was there," Thomas murmured, more to the memory than to the room. "I came in from the ridge with frost on my beard." I hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 days. A woman gave me bread with rosemary and said, "Warm things should be handed to someone, not left on a shelf." Clara's hands paused above the pot. Her line hung between them, threaded across years of wind. Slowly she looked up. "I said that to a dozen men that night. I meant it every time." His jaw tipped, a breath catching. He studied her, the way the shawl crossed and pinned at the shoulder, the plainness that refused to apologize for itself. And he knew, with the quiet certainty a man gets when weather turns, that she was the one who had pressed bread into his hand and kept him from walking out into that snow. "You were the woman," he said. She blinked, not startled, so much as humbled. "Maybe. Or maybe I was just the hands." The whole room was mercy that night. He took a step into the kitchen, palms open, as if approaching a shy colt. "I never thanked you. Looks like you've been paying it forward," Clara replied gently, glancing toward Eli and Rosie by the hearth. "That's the only thank you that lasts." They ate at the small table, 4 spoons moving through broth that tasted like hope grown from yesterday's heel. Rosie fell asleep upright, her head tucked against Clara's shoulder, while Eli fought bravely to keep his eyes open, like a sentry on the night watch. Thomas took his time with the last spoonfuls, the rosemary rising with each breath, soaking the memory until it softened. After breakfast, Thomas fetched the toolbox and went to the back door, where the bottom hinge had sagged for a season and a half. He could have left it, he had left it, but the house had a different center of gravity now, and neglect no longer felt like caution. It felt like rudeness. He planed the edge, reset the screws. When he finished, the door swung true, closing with a sound like a note finding its chord. Out by the well, he drew water until the rope groaned. Clara met him with the wash pan, and without a word they fell into a rhythm older than flirtation and steadier than courtesy. Draw, carry, pour. Suds, ring, pin. Eli ran the line across the yard, proud of the tautness. Rosie stuck clothespins on her fingers like tiny wooden birds and made them peck the air. The sheet snapped once in a gust and then settled, white as a sail pointed towards somewhere kinder. "Do you have a church here?" Clara asked, not meeting his eyes, as if the answer might require delicacy. "We do. Haven't been much since—" He let the rest finish itself against the fence post. She nodded, understanding wholly what he could not say aloud. "We could try it again," she suggested. "Sometimes pews remember the shape of a man's grief and hold it without tipping." He looked at her, then long enough for her to feel the look and look away. "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes a kitchen does that better." They worked until the shadows lengthened and the stove wanted feeding. In the afternoon quiet, Clara found the mending pile shirts, whose elbows knew too much fence wire, a dress faded to memory. She threaded her needle and began her stitches, not fussy, but faithful. Thomas sanded the splintered rail on the porch steps until the grain lay smooth under his palm. Every small correction said what neither of them would risk in words you matter enough to tend. Just before supper, a slant of sun fell through the kitchen window and landed on the enamel cup Thomas had picked up at the depot. It glowed an honest blue chipped where it had been asked to do more than it was built for. He reached for it, turned it once, then set it by the stove where Clara could reach it without stretching. "That storm at St. Bride's," he said as she ladled stew. "I was sure I'd turn mean if it lasted one more night. Then you put bread in my hand and reminded me there's a better use for my strength." "Storms do that," she answered, wiping the rim of a bowl with the hem of a towel. "They try to teach us to hoard. We have to unlearn it on purpose." He caught himself smiling, a rare thing, unpracticed rusty at the corners. "I don't know that I've got purpose figured." "You've got a hammer," Clara said, nodding toward the mended hinge, "and a child who laughs when you come in the room. That'll do for a start." When the meal was done and the children bedded down in the small side room, Eli on the pallet nearest the wall, Rosie tucked in beside the boarded window, Clara stepped out to the stoop. The sky looked like it had been rubbed with a soft cloth until the stars showed through. She wrapped her shawl tighter, feeling the weight of the day settle in gentler places than her bones. Behind her, the screen door creaked and eased closed. Thomas stood with his hands in his pockets, eyes lifted to the same shy scatter of light. "Thank you," he said. "For what? For bringing Rosemary back into this house." She let the words rest a while. "It means remembrance," she told him. "Some say it keeps moths out of the bread box. I think it keeps despair out of the kitchen." He nodded, then cleared his throat like a man about to try a language he hadn't spoken in years. "You and the children, you can stay as long as you choose. Not because of debt, not because of pity, because you put life back where silence had squatted." She felt the ache behind her ribs do something she hadn't allowed in months loosen. "I'll work for it," she said softly. "Work is the one prayer I know how to say without stumbling." "Then we'll pray together," Thomas answered, a little surprised at himself and not hating it. Inside, Rosie turned in her sleep and sighed. The house answered with a tiny settling groan that sounded to both of them like consent. The wind lifted the washed sheet once more and let it fall as if blessing the roof. Memory had come home, not the kind that drags you backward, but the kind that gives today a recipe. Bread rises, hinges hold, a cup chipped still pours. And two strangers who had once met through a mercy no one recorded found at last a name for the quiet between them. If yesterday has taught today how to rise, what will tomorrow ask of their courage? When the town's whispers arrive and old debts come calling at the door, the Boone Ranch did not live in a bubble. Even when the hills felt like their own small kingdom, the town of Ash Hollow was only a wagon's ride away, and towns like Wynn have a way of slipping under every door. 3 days after Clara and the children had arrived, Thomas hitched the wagon to fetch feed nails and lamp oil. Clara offered to stay back to mend and scrub, but he had shaken his head. Better to stand in whispers than be the subject of them unseen. So she rode along Eli, wedged proud between them. On the bench, Rosie nestled asleep in her lap. The road dust rose like old ghosts, and in Clara's chest another kind of dust stirred memories of faces that had once laughed at her size, her age, her failures. She braced herself. Ash Hollow's main street was alive with its usual chorus wagons, rattling tin signs, clinking the dry rasp of gossip on every corner. Clara felt the eyes before she saw them. Women half-turned behind flour sacks, men leaning lazy on hitching posts, their grins curling mean. That her, the one with the brood, a voice muttered. "She offered up her children, so I heard." "Desperate stock," another replied. The words were arrows sharp meant to pierce. Clara steadied her breathing, smoothing Rosie's hair, as if the child's curls could anchor her own dignity. She would not bow, not again. Inside, the mercantile silence thickened. The shopkeeper, Mrs. Halpern, lifted her brows at Thomas, then at Clara, and the air grew brittle. Clara placed her list on the counter. Feed, nails, lamp oil. "And if you've got it, flour enough for 2 loaves. Her voice did not tremble, though her knees ached from holding. Mrs. Halpern sniffed. "You've mouths to feed, do you?" Thomas stepped forward. "My mouths," he said evenly. "And I pay cash." His silver dollars hit the counter with a finality that ended all questions. But whispers are not coins. They do not stay in one place. By the time they loaded the wagon, 2 ranch hands had sauntered up one with a smirk that smelled of cheap tobacco. Didn't think you were the kind to buy another man's burden boon, he sneered. His eyes slid to Clara, then to the children. Guess you like them secondhand. Before Clara could flinch, Thomas stepped down from the wagon. He didn't raise his fists, only stood tall, his shadow stretching long in the afternoon sun. Mind your stock before you mind mine. My ranch is fed, my house is clean, and my children laugh at supper. Can you say the same? The man shifted, muttered something low, and slunk back into the crowd. The second followed. Silence fell heavy until a child's laugh, Eli's, quick and unguarded, broke it. They rode home with the wagon heavier, not from supplies, but from the weight of what had been seen. Clara pressed the flour sack to her chest like it was wholly whispering thanks under her breath. Thomas kept his eyes on the road, jaw tight, but when he reached for the reins, his hand brushed hers, an accident, or maybe not. That night, in the quiet of the mended kitchen, Clara shaped the first real bread the ranch had seen in months. She kneaded slowly her palms, pressing memory into dough, every insult absorbed, every hunger turned to strength. As the loaf rose near the fire, Rosie curled up against her side and murmured, Mom, it smells like Sunday. Tears blurred the crust as it browned, but when Thomas broke the loaf in half and handed her the first piece, the tears turned salt into sacrament. For the first time in years, Clara tasted belonging. But belonging, she knew, always comes with a price. The town may not forgive a woman who arrives with nothing but hunger and pride intact. What will happen when the whispers sharpen into action and old debts come riding from the past? The bread was only the beginning. For a few weeks, the Boone Ranch breathed differently. Laughter returned, faint but real, drifting through the rafters like smoke that smelled sweet instead of bitter. Clara planted beans in a tidy row near the barn. Eli carried water, with shoulders too small but spirit too wide. Rosie chased chickens and squealed when they squawked. And in the evenings, Thomas sat longer at the table, not rushing away to silence. Yet even tender shoots must push through hard ground. Whispers carried farther than they ought. A cruel voice at the well, a mocking laugh in the street, old debts stirring like rattlesnakes in tall grass. One night after the children had gone to bed, Clara found herself sitting at the porch edge, the stars pale above her hands, folded over her apron. Thomas joined her, boots heavy, his face a map of storms. They don't stop, she whispered, not looking at him. Who, he asked, though he already knew. Them, the town, the voices. They say I'm desperate, that you took pity, that I traded my shame for your charity. Her voice trembled, the words tumbling like stones long held in the throat. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Let them talk. They don't live in this house. They don't put food on our table. But Clara shook her head. It isn't just them, it's me. Every word they say, I've heard it before in other mouths. My father when he called me useless. My husband when he left with another. Every insult I swallowed every day, I worked myself raw just to prove I was more than what they saw. And yet, here I am still hearing it. Silence stretched, aching, until Thomas spoke low, his voice rough like gravel. You think I don't know what it is to be measured by whispers. They called me a half-man after the war. Said I came back with a body strong, but a spirit gone. They don't know what it costs to keep breathing when half of you wants to lie down in the dirt with the ones you buried. His words fell like a confession he had long feared to speak. Clara turned, startled, her breath catching. Thomas, he did not meet her eyes. I've lived in silence because it was easier than fighting their tongues. But since you walked into this house, the silence feels less like a coffin and more like a choice. Don't let them bury you with words. Tears burned hot, and she pressed her hands against them. I'm so tired of proving I deserve to stay. Tired of carrying hunger, tired of watching the children's eyes dim. I'm tired, Thomas. At that he did meet her gaze, steady as stone. Then stop proving. Just stay. The words cracked something open. Clara wanted to believe them, but part of her resisted, clawing with old habits. If I stop proving, will I be cast aside again? Before she could answer, Eli's voice carried from the doorway, thin and trembling. Mama, I had a dream. You were gone. His eyes shone with tears. Clara rose and gathered him into her arms, whispering into his hair. I'm here. I'm not leaving. Behind her, Thomas's shadow stretched long in the lantern glow. For the first time, she wondered if he wasn't just offering her shelter, but asking for it too. The night held its breath. The breaking point had not shattered them apart but bound them tighter, though neither dared name it yet. Two weary souls revealed their wounds under the same stars, but scars alone cannot build a future. What happens when Clara's past comes knocking, demanding more than whispers, and Thomas must choose whether to fight for her openly? The air in Ash Hollow shifted when a rider from the east arrived, a man with a polished hat, a gold watch chain, and a mouth that never softened. His name was Calvin Brewer, though Clara had once called him husband. Years ago, he had left her without a word, taking another woman and her dowry, while Clara was left with debts and disgrace. Now he stood in the mercantile doorway, his eyes narrowing as if she were still a possession he had misplaced. "So it's true," he drawled. "You're here, making a wife of yourself again." His gaze flicked to Thomas, then to Eli and Rosie, and dragging brats along to do it. The words struck like whips, though Clara had braced for them her whole life. Her hands shook, but she steadied them over the flour sack she held. "You lost the right to name me long ago." Thomas, who had been silent at her side, stepped forward, his frame solid as oak. "She owes you nothing. You'd do best to leave." But Calvin only smirked. "She owes me her reputation, Boone. And you, what do you think? You've bought a woman cast aside past her prime, mocked in every town she's walked through. You're welcome to her shame." The mercantile went quiet, all ears waiting. For a heartbeat, Clara felt that old sinking the earth giving way beneath her dignity. She almost believed Calvin's words. Almost. Then she felt Rosie's small hand tugging her skirt and Eli's shoulders squaring beside her. And she remembered Thomas's words on the porch. "Stop proving. Just stay." She drew in breath, long and steady, and met Calvin's eyes. "I am no one's shame. Not anymore. If you came to laugh, laugh alone. I've carried hunger loss and work that would break most men, and I am still standing. That makes me more than you ever were." The words surprised even her, rising from somewhere she thought had long gone quiet. Calvin's face tightened, the smirk gone. But before he could answer, Thomas spoke, voice low, but ringing like iron struck true. "You called her worthless," he said. "But I've seen her feed two hungry children with less than scraps. I've watched her turn dust into bread, silence into song. If that's worthless, then I'll take her worth over gold any day." The shopkeeper, Mrs. Halpern, who had once sniffed at Clara, pressed her lips together and looked down. Others in the store shifted uneasily. Whispers began, but this time not sharp, more hushed, thoughtful. Calvin, seeing the tide turn, spat on the floorboards and stalked out into the sun, his boots striking hard against the boards. The bell above the door trembled in his wake. For a moment Clara's knees wavered. Old wounds bled, invisible, but she was still upright. She had not begged. She had not shrunk. On the wagon ride home, the children clutched closer, and Thomas held the reins firm, his jaw set, but his eyes softer when they turned toward her. "You didn't need me to defend you," he said quietly. "No," she admitted, "but I needed to know I could defend myself." Her hands rested on the sack of flour the same way they had once clung to survival itself. "And I did." The prairie wind carried their silence, but it was no longer empty. It was the silence of something breaking open the old chains, the weight of shame cracking enough to let light through. She faced the man who once called her worthless and found her own voice instead. But can this fragile strength endure when life demands more than defiance, when it asks for trust and for love? The days after Calvin Brewer's departure felt different, as though the air itself had shifted on the Boone Ranch. It wasn't louder, not filled with fanfare or victory. It was quieter, but in that quiet was room enough to breathe. Clara rose each morning with a steadier step. She no longer flinched at the sound of horses on the road, no longer braced herself for a voice tearing her down. She planted beans, mended shirts, baked bread, and still carried her scars, but she carried them upright. And slowly she noticed the way Thomas moved around her. He was a man who said little, but silence had its own language. She saw it in the way he lingered in doorways to hear her humming, in the way he cut firewood faster when she struggled with buckets just so she wouldn't strain, in the way his eyes softened, not pity, not hunger, but something steadier, respect. One evening after the children had gone to sleep, Clara sat sewing by lamplight, the house smelling of rosemary and bread. Thomas entered quietly, holding something in his hand. It was a smooth stone, pale polished until it caught the firelight. Found it by the creek, he said. His voice was low, almost shy. Shaped like a heart if you squint. Clara set her sewing aside, fingertips brushing the stone. It was cool, solid, worn by time. It's beautiful, she whispered. He nodded. So are you. The words startled her more than she expected. Beautiful at 50 with lines on her face, hands thickened by years of work and a body long mocked for its weight. She had heard laughter when she entered rooms, whispers that called her too much, too plain. But never had she heard that word spoken with such quiet certainty. Tears blurred her eyes, but she steadied herself. Thomas, she began, voice breaking. Why me? Why choose a woman the world's already dismissed? He met her gaze then, and there was no wavering. Because I see you. Not what they say, not what they mock. You feed the hungry. You stand when you've been beaten down. You make this house feel like a home again. That's worth more than all their talk. The stone trembled in her palm. For the first time, she realized love did not need to be begged nor proven. It could simply be offered and received. She wanted to speak, but her throat tightened. Instead, she reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. It was rough, calloused, steady. He did not pull away. That night, she lay awake beneath the quilt, the stone resting on the nightstand. The children breathed softly in the next room. The house felt different, less a place borrowed, more a place chosen. In the dark, she whispered to herself, I can stay, not because I must, but because I am wanted. For the first time, Clara dares to believe she is worthy of love, not borrowed or pitied, but chosen. Yet hope is still fragile. Can this tender bond survive the final test of the heart? Spring came late to Ash Hollow that year. Snow clung to the mountains, but in the valleys, green pushed through anyway. Quiet, stubborn, like the kind of love that doesn't shout but stays. On the Boone Ranch, the air carried a new rhythm. Eli ran faster now, his laughter echoing across the fields. Rosie sang while feeding the chickens, her small voice weaving into the morning air. And Clara, once bowed beneath hunger and shame, walked with her shoulders square, as though the earth beneath her feet had finally claimed her as its own. Still, questions lingered in her heart. Could this fragile life last? Could a woman of 50, scarred and worn, really be enough for a man like Thomas One? One evening after supper, Thomas asked her to walk with him to the ridge. The sun was falling low, painting the prairie in gold. The children trailed behind at first, then ran ahead, chasing the wind. When they reached the ridge, Thomas stopped. He carried no flowers, no fine ring, only his steady eyes, his scarred hands, and a small wooden box he had carved himself. Inside was the smooth stone he had once given her, now bound with a thin leather cord. He cleared his throat, voice unsteady but sure. I don't have riches. I don't have promises of ease. But I do have this land, these children, and what's left of my heart. And I'd give them gladly to you if you'll stay. Clara's breath caught. All her life she had waited for someone to claim her, to prove she was enough. But here was a man asking not to claim her, but to walk beside her. She reached for the stone, tears warming her cheeks. I don't need ease. I don't need riches. I only need a place where love is real. And I have found it with you. The children, sensing something sacred, slipped their hands into hers. Eli whispered, Does this mean you're really ours? Mama Clara bent down, gathering them close. Yes, my loves, I'm yours. Always. When she rose, Thomas was waiting, his arms open. For the first time in years, she stepped into them, not as a beggar, not as a woman trading her worth for scraps, but as herself, whole. The prairie wind hushed as though the land itself bore witness. That night, under a sky jeweled with stars, Clara sat by the hearth, the stone resting against her chest. For the first time, she did not wonder if she was enough. She knew she was, because love had found her not in spite of her years, her scars, or her size, but because of them. And together with Thomas, with Eli, with Rosie, she had not just survived, she had come home. Sometimes the most powerful love begins not with grand gestures, but with quiet words whispered in the dust of despair. Take my children instead of me. From that broken place, a new story unfolded, one where a mother's sacrifice became the seed of a home, and a lonely cowboy discovered that his heart still had room to love. We are reminded that dignity does not vanish in poverty, and hope is not lost in suffering. Even in the harshest seasons, kindness has the power to turn strangers into family and wounds into doorways for healing. Perhaps like Clara, you too have faced moments where you felt unwanted, unseen, or left behind. And yet your story is not finished. Love often comes later, softer and steadier than we expect. Friends, let this story be a gentle reminder. No matter your age, no matter your scars, you are worthy of belonging and of love that stays. If this tale touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, where we share more stories of second chances and quiet strength. Share this video with someone who might need hope today and leave us a comment. Would you like to see what happens next in their lives or hear another story like this? Because sometimes the next chapter you're waiting for might be the most beautiful one yet.